Hi, my name is Carleen Anderson, and I am a futuristic artist. Um, Before telling you how I got to be a futuristic artist, let me start at the beginning. I was raised by my birth father's parents, who were Pentecostal believers, Christian fundamentalists, and I was born in the late 1950s. And I saw a lot of drama in the church in their way of um, praising, giving thanks and gratitude to the God they served. And all of this was around music. It was around music, it was around poetry. The poetry that you had in the Holy Bible was primarily it. And by the time I was 7, my grandfather, my birth father's father, they had raised me from infancy. He had heard me practicing making songs on the piano in the family home. I was raised in the same house that my birth father was born in, so that it was a very tight knit type of family situation. And my grandfather heard me writing songs about things that would be happening in my daily school life. Susie stepped on my toe or whatever, and I'd write a song about it. Um, and my grandfather decided or encouraged me to write something more productive about the community itself and whatever was happening either with our family or with the world at large, listening to the news and so forth of the day. And that was where I began to write songs about life. And my task at 7 years old was to, every Friday after school and before Saturday afternoon choir practice, I'd have to come up with at least one, sometimes two songs that was about the community or the world at large to teach to the choir to sing every Sunday. This was something I loved to do because I loved putting music to stories. And it comes natural to me because my birth father is a minister in Compton, and my grandfather was a minister in Houston, Texas, so it was something that was just in our family, and I grew up around it. And I loved to hear how it was that they told a story, and they always told their stories musically. Granted, they were telling the stories from the moral objective from what was in the Holy Bible, but it was a trend that I grew up with and something that I loved to do. I found a great deal of healing from it, and my purpose was, the task that my grandfather had put to me was to pass on that healing to the people in our congregation. However, I had no plans at all to do this for a living. This was something for my own personal healing and something to do for the community as I was instructed by my grandfather to do. This was the reason for that. However, I did have an opportunity to see other types of music, although I was basically encased in this Pentecostal music, gospel music, alongside with classical music, because my birth father's older sister, Betty Faye Anderson, was a classically trained vocalist as well as a gospel vocalist. And her favorite singer was Maria Callas, so I studied her because my auntie studied her. And I also, my auntie would sing for the civil rights movement at the time. She sang at Emmett Till's funeral, who was a 14-year-old boy who had been murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan during that period when simply being alleged that you whistled at a white woman could get you killed, and he was murdered for that. So she sang it at his funeral. The 14-year-old boy, he was from Chicago visiting in Mississippi. This was a big turning point in the civil rights movement. She was often a sought-after singer but more of a foot soldier, not very famous, but very much sought after. Very, very different in her styles and how that she would blend together classical music with gospel music within a phrase. She could come within one beat. She'd be singing a gospel note and turn that note into a classical operatic note. I've never heard anything like it, and I've always loved that sound, and I hear her in my head every time I sing whatever I'm singing. She also sang at before Dr. Martin Luther King gave his last sermon. No one knew at the time that this would be the last sermon. This was for the sanitation workers, and it wasn't an actual big event at the time. But it turned out to be, obviously, because he was assassinated. But she was part of that, the people who were in groups who were workers more so than people who were heavily highlighted. But she was in a different type of mindset than my grandparents were. My grandparents were very, very conservative, and their way of dealing with these kind of things came from being self-sufficient as opposed to protesters. And then that was a whole nother situation with James Brown, who then became my godfather, who I called Uncle James because he grew up with my stepfather, Bobby Bird, who had married my birth mother, Vicki Anderson, real name Myra Barnes. But so those connections were very different as well. And so all of these different musical backgrounds, I was very fortunate to be listening to and in different areas. The primary one is gospel music, but also had classical music, and then came the soul that then morphed into funk music over the years. My first memory of meeting Uncle James was when I was 6 years old, and my birth mother, Vicki Anderson, had contacted my grandmother about seeing me while she was in town. I saw her during those days maybe once or twice a year whenever they would come into town. But as far as my grandfather was concerned, which is on my birth father's side of the family, which are very religious, very fundamentalist Christians. So even wearing no sleeves like I am doing now would be considered a sin. So James Brown music for him, for my grandfather, was the devil's music. You wouldn't have anything to do with that. So that meant my grandmother had to maneuver a way to get me to see this concert without my grandfather knowing. And my grandfather was very loquacious. He could speak forever, as does my birth father, and I've kind of caught that as well. So his sermons would last at least 3 hours. So the plan was, once he would get into the pulpit, they'd call a taxi, have the taxi take me to the Houston Coliseum. Coliseum was a great place back in the day, during that time, the early 60s. I'm not sure if it even exists anymore. But I would go there, see my birth mom and the show, and then come back before my grandfather was done with his sermon. And while I was there, I saw all of these different people. It was like being at the circus, really. I mean, really excited about it all, because you have everything happening that you wouldn't normally have. I was sat on the edge of the stage, so where I could see everything, because it was so tiny they didn't want to lose me. So I sat on the edge of the stage. So I'm at the front of the stage, but you've got all these people surrounding it, and you've got security guards in the front, so to keep me from being bombarded by them. But this was a theatrical thing as well, because it was more than just, okay, it's your turn to sing, da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, it's the next turn. So it was an actual production. You had comedy and storytelling and the whole bit. And so all of these connected for me as the kind of singing storyteller that I am now comes from seeing these kind of things and witnessing them and them being ingrained in me by watching it happen as a young kid. And backstage, I was instructed by my birth mother at the time to say to the various ones who were backstage to sing. And the song I knew at the time was 50 Nifty United States, 50 Nifty United States of the 13 original colonies, Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, that whole type of thing. And as I was singing this, Uncle James came in. At the time, he was just James Brown. But I saw people looking past me over my head, and I turned to look around to see who it was, and it was him. He was such a big deal that I nearly passed out. And as I was in that passing out phase, he picked me up. And he said, "Oh, what a pretty girl you are. You're so pretty." No, he said, "Oh, you're so pretty." And I went, "Oh, you're so pretty too." I bet your mom told you to say that. It's a minor little thing in the whole scheme of things of what people remember, but it's something that stuck with me, obviously, because it was the first time that I ever met him. And I've seen him off and on throughout the years. The last time I saw him was a few years before he died. He had me come on stage and do an impromptu performance for him because there was a documentary being filmed about my career up until that time, and he agreed to be in it. It's called Grace and Favors, and it was filmed at the Royal Albert Hall. This was in 2003, I think it was 2002, 2003, a few years before he died. But all of those things obviously stay in your mind. The fact that I performed with him wasn't something, again, wasn't planned, and never, ever did I ever expect, to be honest. Well, why would you? It was not something I would have considered to do, to get on stage with him. But he was very, very welcoming, very supportive, of me being on stage with him. And I was in my 40s then, but he was still, treating me like this little 6-year-old that he first met back all those years before. When I got back to church, that they organized it so that my grandmother was called before and told that I was coming back, and she had a bucket of soapy water to wash off the sin being smelling like cigarettes or drinking alcohol and so forth, that you would get these smells into your clothes if you're around it. And that would be a telltale sign if my grandfather smelled it, so, But this was washed off before I went into the temple. But it was a lasting memory for me as to how different people see and interpret life and how music impacts that for them. For my birth mother and my stepfather, even though they also came from gospel backgrounds, it was the free aspect of music that relieved them. For my auntie, my birth father's older sister, who had studied classical music but was also a gospel singer, it was an element of protest in there that music was for her, as well as gratitude. With my grandparents, their music was primarily gospel, although they did appreciate classical music as well. But it was more about soldiering on and, again, being surviving, self-sustaining. That was what music was for them. And all of those things impacted on me as I grew up and as I wrote music myself. And music became something that I did as a healing thing, but it was never something that I thought I would do for my supper. It was not something that I considered. I studied classical music and jazz music at the University of Southern California, and my goal was to teach. I was planning on being a music school teacher, but then Ronald Reagan took all of the arts out of the schools and that option went away because at the time black music teachers weren't hired in private schools, So your option was to work in the government schools, and that was my plan. But then that plan was gone. What followed that was that my godfather, Uncle James, was incarcerated. And when he was incarcerated, that meant nobody worked. For a while, back in the 60s, everyone worked at the same time because the circumstances were that funding was possible so that you could take out a big show and you could have a gazillion people out on the road with you. But as disco came in and various other kinds of marketing aspects started in the 70s and the 80s, this was no longer possible. And so he would hire people on a rota, so you might have a group of people, 3 or 4 of them that might work for 3 to 6 months, and then that would turn over, and then the next group would come in and work. So that meant times were quite tough for a lot of them, mostly every one of them, and it meant that Uncle James was working the most, obviously, because he was the one who was most sought after. However, Marco Nelson and Femi Williams, who later became the Young Disciples, they were a fan of that music, fan of the James Brown music and all of the other artists that made names for themselves, having been with Uncle James, Maceo Parker, my stepfather Bobby Byrd, my birth mother Vicki Anderson, Lynn Collins, Marva Whitney, Fred Wesley, Pee Wee Ellis. All of these people were now out of work because Uncle James was incarcerated. But Marco Nelson and Femi Williams contacted my stepfather, Bobby Byrd, and asked him if he wanted to come and do a tour in England and possibly in Europe. So Pops, being Pops, ever so generous Pops, put together the JB All-Stars, which included all of these people that I mentioned. And the only concern was who was going to open the show, because all of these guys were now stars in their own right. They had their own albums and were promoting their own careers, solo careers. And none of them wanted to be the one who opened the show. They needed a no-name to open the show. Me, no name. And hence how I was brought into it. It wasn't a career move. It was something you did because the family asked you to, much like the family would, it might be your turn to set the table, or it might be your turn to wash the dishes, or you might be on the rotor to, mop the kitchen floor, or whatever. It was, you come from a big family, the jobs and tasks are spread about. And that was the task at hand. It wasn't something that I saw as something to step from, because it was the last thing that I could see that I could benefit from as something that I wanted for my life. I was a divorced mom by this time, and I didn't want to be away from my child and so forth. But as a thing to do for the family, and it was only a couple of days, I think it was like 10 days or something, which I did, and I met Marco Nelson and Femi Williams, and they were able to catch me when Pops wasn't around. Pops was really, really, really protective, knowing what the industry is like. He didn't want his daughter talking to any guy in the industry, period. And they managed to catch me in the tour bus when he wasn't about, and they approached me about working for them. They heard me sing, heard me open up for the show, and I was received very warmly from the London audience. It was at the Town and Country, is what they called it then, back in '89. it's slipping my memory now what it's called now. It's still there. Kentish Town Forum is what it's called now, I think. But it's the same place, same building. It's just changed names over the years. And they enjoyed what I did, and they wanted to know if I wrote music and so forth, and told me that I could earn my keep by singing and writing music if that was something I wanted to do. And it never occurred to me that I could earn my keep by doing that. One, because that side of the family was so successful at it. And to me, they were proper entertainers, proper singers, that wasn't something that I still don't think that I possess. I'm a storyteller who sings. I sing stories, but that's very, very different than an entertainer and very different than a singer, I find, to me, in my mind. Although people who follow my music would probably categorize me as such. It's not how I would see myself. So to get offered a job like that seemed completely out of the blue. It seemed to suit me and to fit me to be a music school teacher, but not to be a performer. But given that the situations were as it was, the fact that I was no longer with the option to be able to teach music because that was gone, the government schools no longer had arts in them, and because of the social conditions, being a mom, a single mom, I had been divorced by then, a single mom raising her black boy by herself and all of the problems that comes with that, being offered to raise my child in a different environment was something that I considered a great opportunity, and I was so glad that I took it, and I've never ever regretted one single second of having done that, because it's meant a better life for my son, better life for me, and it's given me a career. Career is something I wouldn't have chosen to do, but I found my feet in doing it. And in doing that, I worked with Marco and Femi, which we then became the Young Disciples, but it was nothing ever planned. It wasn't your traditional story about a band who got together and they rehearsed in the garage and so forth. They went on tour. That was never the case. The thing with this group was that they were planning to just make some music to spin at Dingwalls, or there was a club at the time called the Fez. But it was never ever intended to be more than that. That was it. And what they had suggested to me was that because I sang and wrote music, is that I would be able to get session work and be able to write songs for other people. And so I was basically going to be a behind-the-scenes type of performer or music artist. That was not a performer, but a behind-the-scenes music artist. That was the thing that I thought I was going to do. None of us expected for it to happen as it did, for it to catch on, for it to first it caught on in the clubs, and then Giles Peterson and Norman J, he's an MBE now, were working. They were both working they got jobs at Phonogram, Polydor, Talking Loud Records, and they started signing up all of their friends that they had been playing their white label records to. So there was Galliano, I think it was Incognito, maybe De-Influence, Omar, quite a lot. I don't think the brand new heavies had happened yet. I think they were, but it was a scene that was called acid jazz, for lack of a better name, but that was the scene. It was the early 90s. And I was just really fortunate because there was this group of people who were beyond just being music makers. They were thinkers, they were writers, they were artists, they were journalists, theater people. It was just a whole community of people in the art world who were thinkers. And it was a very different kind of surrounding to be in, where you'd have these conversations about life in general. And that influenced how it was I wrote my music. The guys were very much into this new style of music, though. The guys being Marco and Femi were in this new kind of putting together tracks with samples and looping drums. I had come from a completely and totally live atmosphere, so it was very, very strange to me to be piecing together these bits and then sampling from somebody else's music. And I was like, why would you take somebody else's music? Let's just make your own. So that was a very confusing thing for me to grasp. And I had to just make the music on my own, and then they would add their bits afterwards. Because at first, initially, they would give me a backing track, and it was like, I'm a storyteller. I can't fit the songs into these places. I need to actually write the song, which is the story, and then you can place it around it accordingly.